in listening to some of your stories when you're doing investigation, right? I can sense, that some part of the work could be dangerous, could be stressful, dangerous, very difficult to handle, pressure. So I want to talk to you a bit about how do you deal with these kind of challenges. In the past, I've heard you mention about death threats, danger to your team, try and go out and do field work on investigation. So can you give us some examples and how do you guys deal with this kind of pressure?
Yeah. I mean, to start off, so I don't think we've had death threats directed at us, thankfully. But we have had other threats, I'll sue you, or things like that, which are fairly common. But I think how we deal with it is we started very small. We were a young team. We were navigating this very slowly and very carefully, and we slowly built that capacity. We slowly built that awareness on where the risks were. And we were also very lucky again because we were kind of given a lot of leeway to pick and choose the kind of issues. So by committing to documentary style journalism, you get to pick and choose, right? It's not daily news where the news is you have to go and you have to report. So in our case, some things that we felt were not safe, we don't do. So we've had to make some very painful decisions on some issues that we knew were important, but we did not have the capacity to do. And in some cases, we also speak to maybe some colleagues at international media outlets and, maybe just if that's something you're interested, you might want to look into. Obviously, you can't give everything away, but I don't think we need to compete in that sense. So, So we always, like I said, sometimes we are just waiting for the right moment where we know it's safe to proceed. So that's how we deal with risk. And in terms of safety, as with any type of investigative journalism, and I always say this, there's always going to be an element of risk. Always. You just have to accept that when you become an investigative journalist. What we are trained to do then is to assess the risk and mitigate against it as best as we can. So we do have a process, and we developed it over a few years. And
can you share a bit about that process or some elements of it?
Sure. Yeah, it's very boring. It's really just about going through a risk assessment form, and I always try to tell them, please take this seriously, guys. It's not just another form. It's not just paperwork. It's really there to force you to think.
Okay, I'm going to push this because
Sure.
I feel like, for people who are interested in journalism, right?
Yeah.
This is not boring at all.
Okay.
These are things that, it's only available to you after you have spent 5-10 years in the field and learn all the lessons, make all the mistakes.
Yeah.
Right? So can you just give us a few examples of what would be on this form?
Sure. So the basic stuff is list out 1, 2, 3. What are the physical risks, for example, environmental risks. So environmental risks, sometimes things that you really if you're going to be investigating orang asli rights in rainforest somewhere, what are the environmental risks? You might get trampled on by an elephant, which almost happened to one of our journalists, right? So you have to, So over time you realize, yes, environmental risks are very important. You might get dengue. You might get food poisoning. So there's health risks, there's environmental risks, there's physical risk. So list down all of them. Think about the different types of risks you're going to face. Cyber risk. When you're doing this investigation with somebody, especially if you're dealing with sensitive documents, is it encrypted? Is your device's password protected? Two-factor authentication, all of that. So you list down those risks. How are you going to mitigate them? Another thing that we push them to think about is who are the authorities that we are in touch with. So I would always say, make sure that we find at least one officer or someone in a position of authority that we can trust before we proceed. Sometimes not always. Thankfully, so far we haven't done an issue where we haven't been able to find someone like that. So in many cases, and I think this is true around the world, right? In many cases, there is some corruption involved, that there might be some officers involved or authority, the people in authority that are involved. But there is, at least in my experience, there will always be good officers. There will always be good police officers, wildlife, like rangers, when we were doing the illegal wildlife trafficking thing, immigration officers who really, they are there to do the right thing. It shouldn't come to people as a surprise, but I know that's the perception, right? That really, I got that. But it really is true. We have always been able to find these people. I think if you approach them in good faith, you will find the right people. And you obviously you work with civil society as well. These people have worked with, in these areas much longer than we have, because we're always doing different types of topics every time. So you go to the civil society folks for a recommendation, and they'll tell you, this guy is good, or these guys are good. So in your risk assessment, I need you to tell me who is that person, and what is their contact details. Are they aware of what we're doing? Are they on standby? So these are some. Another thing is, there's always somebody else that, as you are active in the field, one of you has to be in a safe location. That you're just checking in with that person. So that means somebody who's back in the office or somebody who's off duty. Before you go actively in, you text the person and tell them, okay, we're going for it now. And then when you're done, you text the person as well that you're done. So that person is then accountable for those who are in the field. So these are just some of the ways that we have developed. I don't know if other people do it the same way, but I've sat in a couple of brief trainings on these things. So I've picked some lessons from them and some from our own experience as well.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Giving Hub.